Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to just briefly introduce myself, and then I'll have my colleague Amanda introduce herself as well. I'm Dave Olson. I'm a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, and I co-direct the Center for Criminal Justice here at Loyola. I've been on the faculty here at Loyola for 25 years, and previously I was a student at Loyola, so I got my undergraduate degree here. And just to show the Curl connection, my one and only sociology class was taken from Curl's original director's wife, Phil Nyden's wife. I took a sociology class from her in the mid 1980s. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Amanda to introduce herself.
Hi all, my name is Amanda Ward, and I am a assistant research professor with a joint appointment between the Center for Criminal Justice and Curl. I have been working at the Center for Criminal Justice and doing research over there for about 6 years. And I think I've been officially with Curl for 2 years. Does that sound about right? Yeah, and I am looking forward to talking to you all today about our work here in Rockford.
Great, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll start the presentation, and just so that me and Amanda don't do the silly dance of asking each other to forward slides. Once I'm done with my part, with the introduction, then I'm going to stop sharing, and then she'll start sharing, and that way we can each control our own screen. So again, thanks for having us. What we're going to be talking about today is research that we're doing in the city of Rockford and Winnebago County on a focused deterrence project that they're undertaking. What I want to do to start our presentation is provide everybody with a little bit of understanding of the Center for Criminal Justice, what we do, and then a little bit about how we got involved working with Rockford and Winnebago County, because I think it's an interesting illustration of how our collaborations with stakeholders is a long-term relationship. Winnebago County is one of the first jurisdictions that the center formally started working with, and I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of our work there. In terms of Loyola Center, the center was actually part of Loyola's strategic plan called Plan 2020, which was completed or released in 2015. From 2015 to 2021, the center was incubated by Loyola's College of Arts and Sciences and the School of Law, and it was formally established within the College of Arts and Sciences as a research center in 2022. So we've got about 7 years worth of centerhood under our belt. In terms of the center structure, it's co-directed by myself and my colleague Don Steeman, who's on the Zoom as well. We've got, in addition to myself and Don, we've got 3 other full-time folks who work in the center, including Amanda, Patrick Griffin, and Brandon DuPont. That's the full-time staff and faculty contingent of the center. In addition, we have graduate students and undergraduate students from across Loyola. So similar to Curl, this is an interdisciplinary center. We have students that work with us from all sorts of disciplines, both in the College of Arts and Sciences as well as outside. Most of our work in the center is focused on performing applied research projects in collaboration with practitioners, policymakers, and social service providers that are involved in the criminal justice space. A lot of our work is being done in Illinois and in the Chicagoland area, but we're engaged in projects across the state as well as across the country. We're working in a number of different jurisdictions on a wide array of criminal justice related projects. Since our establishment, we've obtained over $5 million in external funding from a variety of sources. So we get grants and contracts from federal, state, and local government, but we also get support from private foundations. In addition to primarily focusing on applied research, the center also provides students with opportunities for internships. And this semester, we're experimenting with the delivery of a center course on prison reform that will allow students to not only learn about prison reform and engage research to understand that, but those students will then have an opportunity to do an internship within an advocacy organization that's focused on prison reform this summer. So we're trying to hit all the buttons in terms of research, scholarship, teaching, and service. In terms of our collaboration with Rockford and Winnebago County, it really started in 2016 when our center began to work with stakeholders in Winnebago County to help them create a criminal justice coordinating council. The Criminal Justice Coordinating Council involves involvement and commitment from all of the stakeholders in Winnebago County and the city of Rockford. These include elected officials, officials who are appointed to their position. And since then, we've been engaged in work with them to do research and answer questions that they have to better shape and form their policies and practices. We've also been engaged in a number of process and impact evaluations with them. One of those was what we're calling Rockford Focused Deterrence Project 1, which was the predecessor to what we're going to be talking about today. They had a pilot program that they implemented and that we worked with them to evaluate from 2018 to 2020. We're now working on the Focused Deterrence number 2, which is a reiteration of that. The original project was a federally funded pilot project. The current version of it is funded with local resources. In addition to those things, we're working with them as collaborators to evaluate the implementation and impact of Illinois' Pretrial Fairness Act, which is the law that abolishes cash bail in Illinois and that transforms the pretrial process. And we're also working with them to evaluate a deferred prosecution program that's run out of the state's attorney's office. And so those are some examples of the work that we're doing with Rockford. When I stop talking and I have the ability to cut and paste things, I'll drop in the chat a couple links to documents and information that shows you some of the depth and breadth of the work we've done in Rockford. But to set the stage a little bit for our presentation, I wanted to provide everybody with a little bit of information about Rockford and Winnebago County. So the first important thing is, where in the world is this place? Winnebago County is a county in northern Illinois. It borders Wisconsin. It's about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes northwest of Chicago. The city of Rockford, which is in Winnebago County, is the 5th largest city in the state of Illinois. They've got almost 150,000 residents in Rockford. The county as a whole has almost 300,000 people in it. So it's a fairly large jurisdiction that's separate from the Chicagoland metro area. The other thing that's important to understand about Rockford is the extent and nature of violent crime in Rockford is fairly similar, and in some ways more serious than what we see in the city of Chicago. So just to provide you with some context, the overall violent crime rate in 2020 in Rockford was about 50% higher than in the city of Chicago. So obviously Chicago gets a lot of attention, in part because of the form of violence with high numbers and rates of firearm violence, but Rockford has its own challenges with respect to violent crime. And we've worked with stakeholders there to better understand this. A lot of it stems from issues around domestic violence, and the city is trying to do a lot in terms of preventative efforts with respect to that. More specifically, when we look at firearm homicides and non-fatal firearm emergency room admissions over a 4 to 5 year period, again, you see that Rockford is not that different than Chicago in terms of its rate of firearm violence. And so again, Chicago gets a lot of attention. There are communities across Illinois, including places like Rockford and Peoria and Springfield, that have their own challenges with respect to violent crime. And one of the things the center tries to do is work in those jurisdictions and collaborate in those communities that oftentimes don't have access to a lot of research support that comes with municipalities that house a lot of universities, for example. So a little bit about focused deterrence. I want to provide you with some understanding of what it is for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The first way to think about focused deterrence, for those that are familiar with the public health perspective on violence, focused deterrence is not a primary or secondary prevention program. This program is not to try to prevent youth, for example, from becoming involved in violence. The city of Rockford is doing a lot to address that, working in schools, developing programs for youth. What the Focused Deterrence Project is really what's described in public health terms as a tertiary prevention program. This is designed to intervene in the lives of individuals who have already shown a propensity to engage in violence or in risky gun carrying behavior. So the idea of focused deterrence is that it focuses the limited resources that are available on individuals that pose the highest risk for violence in the community, in particular firearm violence. And it does so with a blended approach of law enforcement strategies, but also mobilization of the community and the provision of social services. So one of the hallmarks of these programs is they identify individuals that are the highest risk in the community, usually individuals that are on some form of supervision by the justice system. What the program does is it couples a deterrent message of a quick and swift response to law breaking and violations of supervision. It couples that with a promise and access to supportive services. And this is achieved through an individual that's referred to as a navigator in Rockford. And it also involves community voice, the ability for community members to communicate directly with these individuals about the impact that violence has on their community. Right? This approach is not something that's new. It's not something necessarily that's novel. It is an evidence-based strategy that research has found support for in terms of its ability to effectively reduce violence, and in particular firearm violence. So for the researchers in the room, I provided a couple citations of some meta-analyses that have been done looking at different approaches to firearm violence and violence overall. In both of these, the general consensus is that programs that involve collaboration between law enforcement, community supervision agencies, and the provision of social supports have a positive effect, have a beneficial effect on reducing violence. And so this was something that was a strategy promoted and supported by the Department of Justice. That's why Rockford got the original grant to test this. And then they've now taken over the funding for it. So I would just want to provide a little background on the evidence basis for this approach. One of the things the program seeks to do is reduce the prevalence of firearm carrying by the individuals that they focus on and that they target. And what we have to recognize is the motivations for individuals carrying firearms illegally can vary. Oftentimes the assumption is that if someone is illegally possessing a firearm, their goal in doing so is to engage in violence and commit crime. There's a fair amount of research done both in Chicago and other jurisdictions that suggests that a lot of this behavior is actually a form of self-protection, that individuals who may be prohibited from owning a firearm still may carry it because of their fear of victimization or their past experiences with respect to victimization. The other thing that's important to keep in mind with these types of programs is that even small reductions in firearm violence can translate into large savings, both financially as well as social savings. The estimate in Illinois is that each non-fatal shooting incident costs roughly $45,000 in the form of medical costs, the cost of first responders, mental health care for the victim, as well as the justice system's response. So a program like this, if it can prevent a handful of non-fatal shootings, can actually be a cost-effective strategy for dealing with the problem. Like I said, most of these programs focus on individuals who are under some form of supervision by the justice system, either probation or parole. So I wanted to provide a little bit of a larger context so that you can understand the program and the specific participants that Amanda is going to talk about. So at the end of last year, there were exactly 3,200 adults under supervision of the justice system for a felony offense in Winnebago County. When people think of individuals convicted of a felony and being justice involved, they assume that all those individuals are in prison. Out of all the people under supervision or the custody of the system in Winnebago County for a felony, less than 30% are physically or were physically in prison at the end of the year. The vast majority of individuals under the supervision of the system are on probation in the community. For those of you not familiar with the terminology, I want to clarify that if somebody is placed on probation, that is the sentence they are given in lieu of them being incarcerated in prison. So at the point of sentencing, a judge determines that they are not of such high risk, or the crime they committed isn't so serious that it requires them to be incarcerated, but rather they can be supervised in the community with the provision of services. The remaining slice of the pie are individuals that are on what's called mandatory supervised release or parole. And so throughout the presentation, we're going to be talking about the number of people on MSR or parole. That's what this population is. These are the individuals that were in prison, have served the prison part of their sentence, and then they're released to the community under a period of mandatory supervised release. And the length of that time that they're supervised depends on the crime for which they were sentenced to prison. So when you look at this pie, what should be visible is the vast majority of people who are under the custody of the system for a felony offense are actually in the community living in Rockford. And this is a pattern that's consistent across the state and across counties. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and we'll do a really smooth transition where Amanda will pick it up and start talking specifically about the program in Rockford and our research there. Man, was that smooth. All right, take it away, Amanda. You're muted. I guess when I said smooth transition, I spoke too soon.
I know. I'm like, there goes the smoothness. I was all lined up and everything. All right, folks. Thank you, Dave. So I'm going to start by just talking about kind of how the program is structured and organized. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the pilot project and the pilot version and this version, very similar structure. So the Focused Deterrence program really is a collaborative program. So there's a project team that consists of representatives from probation, from parole, from the state's attorney's office, the sheriff's office, the police department. There's a representative there from the county board chairman's office, and then the representative that represents the community, the navigator who provides the services. And this project team, along with us from Loyola and Curl, meet on a monthly basis to first identify people who are at risk of reoffending, who are on probation and parole, and who are at risk of committing an additional act of gun violence. And they determine this based on objective risk assessments that are administered by probation and parole as part of their supervision practices, and then also looking at the history that they have of gun violence in the community. On a quarterly basis, they have what they call a call-in, where essentially they're bringing all these individuals in a room. It's at the Rockford Rescue Mission, which is kind of considered to be a neutral community space. And the call-in speakers include the mayor of Rockford, who typically opens up this meeting by welcoming the participants who are on MSR back from prison, welcoming the participants who are on probation, many of whom have recently been in jail, back to the community. There's also representatives from the criminal justice agencies there, the navigator is there, and then also community members who are often either former program participants or people in the community who have lived experience of prison or gun violence. And the purpose of this call-in meeting is to convey to these participants 3 key messages. The first message, the main message, is that gun violence will no longer be tolerated. The second message is that if any of the participants engage in gun violence, there will be swift, certain, and fair consequences for continued involvement in gun violence. So a key component of this evidence-based focused deterrence approach is that individuals are less likely to re-engage in criminal activity if they believe that if they do, that they will be caught quickly, that they will be punished, and that punishment will be fair or proportionate to the offense. And you have to recall that this deterrent message is really being applied to a relatively small audience, people who have demonstrated that they do engage in gun violence. And it really seeks to make some explicit cause and effect connections between the behavior of gun violence and the repercussions, the legal repercussions for that gun violence. And then the third message, and this message comes from the community members, this message is coming from the navigator, is that Rockford has invested in providing them with specific for them social services and other resources to help them, as the navigator puts it, survive and thrive and stay out of prison. So this message is, people have said this message is particularly impactful because the navigator herself is a member of the community. She grew up in Rockford. She has lived experience of being incarcerated and returning to Rockford with a felony on her record, and then had to navigate reentry on her own, figured out what social services to access and how to essentially rebuild her life from that experience. And so this message really is kind of, emblematic of that blended approach of sanctioning plus services. And then on a monthly basis after the call-in, at which so the call-in is required. Participants have to attend the call-in as part of their community supervision, or their parole board orders. But afterwards, they have the choice of whether or not they want to continue to work with the navigator, right? Whether they want to engage in those services. And so the team meets then on a monthly basis to discuss participant progress, identify any project challenges. These meetings are often spaces where probation and parole and the navigator are talking about who is working with her, what they need to move forward, any challenges that it appears the person is facing, any violations they may be committing in terms of not communicating with their parole officer, their probation officer, and so forth. And then in terms of services, the navigator is providing referrals to social services they might need. And what's another interesting kind of blend here between the community and the criminal justice agencies is that the navigator works with the people who are on her caseload, who ask for help with services, to set their own goals in terms of what they want to achieve. And often, they want employment, help getting their GED. They may need help reinstating their driver's license, figuring out where they're going to stay next, getting into apartments and housing, reconnecting with kids, figuring out how to alleviate child support enforcement processes that they cannot pay, and so forth. But the navigator also works with them on identifying and figuring out how to complete the requirements of either their community supervision if they're on parole, or also their board orders if they are on MSR or private or parole. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about the pilot version of the program, which was in 2018 to 2019. And it's a good time to kind of pause. I was thinking about this as I was prepping for it, because the pilot ran for about 2 years, and we're about 2 years into the current version of it. So it's an interesting kind of pause here to take a look at, some of the findings that we had from the original program, and how that might relate to what we're seeing right now in the current iteration of the program. So in that intervention pilot, we had some key questions. We and Winnebago County were really interested in understanding, firstly, is the program implementation actually adhering to the program design, right? Are they indeed targeting people at a high risk of committing additional offenses, particularly violent offenses? And what were the outcomes of that program, right? Did people take advantage of the services? If they did they find those services helpful? What were the outcomes in terms of recidivism? Did people go on to become arrested again? And if they did, what were they arrested for? And we were also interested in seeing whether a program like this, which takes a lot of coordination among criminal justice agencies and these community partners, were they meeting that the program design principles of providing, swift, certain, and fair sanctioning to people who were going on to commit additional offenses, while also providing meaningful access to services. So is the blended strategy indeed happening here? And to answer those questions, we had a variety of methods for collecting information. We did ethnographic observations of every call-in and every monthly operations meeting, and that allowed us to look at how they chose participants, what challenges they were facing in implementing the program, how they overcame those challenges, as well as to what extent are they conveying that message of swift, certain, and fair to program participants. We also followed up with an analysis of video recordings of the call-in. So we had access to recordings of the call-in, and that were taken by the Rockford Police Department. And we had one of our research assistants, student researchers, sit down and actually code those interviews for messages, or code those call-ins for messages related to deterrence and messages related to services, so we could see what the balance was like for the call-ins on a whole. I also interviewed 17 program stakeholders. These were largely the people on that previous slide who were attending the operations meetings and involved with implementing the program. And I was also able to interview 19 program participants to get their sense of what it was like to be on the call-in, whether how that experience may or may not have shaped their thinking around whether they were going to re-engage in criminal activity, as well as whether they found it helpful or useful to interact with the navigator. And it should be noted that my sample there was somewhat biased by the fact that I could really only talk to people who did interact with the navigator and have trust, because those were the people whose contact information was up to date and accurate, and who felt comfortable talking with me. So this is from that pilot slide, or from the pilot evaluation. And of the 74 people who either attended a call-in or who were custom notified of their entry into the program, we see that there was a really high uptake of services. So 66 people, about 88% of the sample, did an intake with the navigator and set at least one goal with her. And we felt like this was promising. This was a high uptake, given that while attending the call-in was mandated by the terms of their supervision, meaning that they would be sanctioned by their parole officer or by their probation officer if they did not go, interacting with the navigator after that was voluntary. They had the option of interacting with her or not. We also found it promising that there was a relatively low recidivism rate. And granted, we have to have some degree of caution when interpreting a recidivism rate of program participants in this case, due in part to they were in the program for a relatively short period of time, right? We were only able to follow them for a short period of time. And most recidivism studies are really going to look at a 3-year time frame, because we know that most individuals who are going to be rearrested following release from prison are going to be rearrested within 3 years. But we see here that amongst people who receive the treatment of having that call-in message, the majority, 65%, were not arrested for a new crime during their time in the program. And then of those who were, most were arrested for aggravated battery or domestic violence. That was 13 people, about 18% of the total sample, followed by those who were arrested for nonviolent offenses. 7 people were arrested for nonviolent offenses, and then about 7% of the sample, or 5 people, were arrested for crimes involving a firearm, either illegal gun possession or for committing an act of violence involving a firearm. And then from a programmatic standpoint, we also had some findings that we thought were interesting in terms of just how the program was running and how people were responding to it. So the first was that amongst the navigator and the program participants that I spoke with, there was some tension in those call-ins, right? The call-ins are a place where they're really, trying to balance deterrent messaging with that promise of services, right? One of the program participants, said, this really feels like a carrot and a stick here, right? They're promises these services, but they're also yelling at us. So the reactions to the call-in were definitely mixed among the participants. I interviewed about 15 of them about how they were responding. And they noted first that it was really intimidating to enter a room with so many police officers and representatives from the criminal justice system. And there was, I would say, some legitimate concern among the participants that the call-in was a setup, right? They were initially worried that they were walking into getting arrested again. And these concerns were especially acute among people who were attending the first couple call-ins, because initially the police were kind of overly present. They would have several of them standing at the front door, and they were patting people down as soon as they came in. And from the police's perspective, this made sense, right? We have a group of people who've been identified as being at a heightened risk of gun violence, and they're entering a room with the mayor of Rockford, right? But after we got feedback from the participants and feedback from the navigator whom they spoke with about it, that it was often, I would say, overly frightening to a way where they were not hearing any of the other messages. The police began to limit the number who were attending, and then also bringing people into a separate room to pat them down, so it was not such a public display. Additionally, the parole officer assigned to this project, the probation agent, and the navigator began actually contacting and speaking directly with participants prior to them attending the call-in, to let them know that this was going to happen, that they were not in danger of being arrested, that they were going to be patted down, and that they were going to receive a message from people in the criminal justice system, in an attempt to kind of allay any fears they might have in advance. Nonetheless, a major component of the call-in is conveying that message of swift, certain, and fair punishments. And most participants, understandably did not react positively to that message. A lot of the messaging coming in the first half of the call-in is about how if they reoffend, they will be punished. And participants that I spoke with generally said that they found that message as unnecessary because they already knew the repercussions of engaging in gun violence. Those repercussions were pretty fresh in their mind as they were just exiting prison or recently had been sentenced with probation. And those that I spoke with did go on to take advantage of the navigator's services and work with her, they identified that as a potential barrier to participant engagement. And those that did go on to take those services noted that despite that message, they were ultimately won over by the second half of the call-in, where the navigator really talked in depth about her experiences and her services and what she was willing to help people with, which they perceived to be a sincere offer of aid from someone who had sat where they had sat. And this was only possible to, the unique role the navigator plays in this program. As a person with lived experience, and as a person who directly knew and was familiar with and lives in not only the neighborhoods where these participants are living, but often knew them or their families or their mothers, or had some experience with them before, she was able to kind of overcome that aspect and build up some trust. So that did also, however, pose some complicated safety concerns for the navigator. So again, as someone deeply embedded in the community and who herself was formerly involved in street violence and street life, the program quickly learned it had to be careful to protect her safety, right? To make sure that anyone chosen for the program didn't have potential gang connections to people that she knew and was related to who were themselves also caught up in gang activity, right? So it's like an interesting issue that came out in that initial pilot version of this project, how to keep the navigator safe as she moved about in different spaces. And then another thing that came out that we found, or I found interesting and surprising, was really the development of this collaborative relationship between the navigator, probation, and parole. They we're going to these monthly operations meetings, talking about the different people in the program and on their respective caseloads and who the navigator was working with. Those conversations were spaces where they really were often triangulating information about the individual, and in ways that often benefited the person. So, for example, when if there was a person on the navigator's caseload who wasn't regularly responding to or calling their probation agent or their parole agent, the parole or probation would reach out to the navigator and be like, hey, what's up with this person? And she was often able to provide information like, oh, he's in the hospital, right? Last week, this happened. He's in the hospital. I'll go over there and tell him to give you a call. And then she would get in her car and drive over to the hospital and be like, hey, I know it's been a couple days. You were supposed to call him back. You didn't. If you call now, it's going to be fine. They just need to know what's going on. So that was a kind of way that they were able to coordinate. The navigator really kind of acted in some ways as a supplement to probation and parole, as a go-between that was able to explain things to the probationer or the parolee in ways that made sense to them about why the supervision rules were what they were, and to encourage them to reach out and communicate with their agent. And then vice versa, to have those conversations with probation and parole, and kind of give them the perspective of the person on our caseload. Granted, those were the people who interacted and were willing to talk to me, right? I know for some people, a barrier to participation was the fact that the navigator was interacting and talking with probation and parole. But amongst those I talked with, they described their relationship with the navigator and their supervision agent as being kind of like a supportive team, or essentially working together to help them fulfill the requirements of their supervision and achieve some of their goals. And then finally, another thing that came out of that initial pilot program was the need for an objective risk score assessment to determine who should indeed be part of the program. In the first go around, probation was using the Ohio Risk Assessment Tool, which is a evidence-based verified risk assessment tool that assigns each person on probation with a risk level, and it's based on a variety of factors that we know empirically are related to the likelihood of rearrest, such as whether the person has safe and secure housing, whether they have supportive family and peers, if they're employed, if they're struggling with substance abuse. And probation was using this tool to determine both the risk of recidivism, which helps them understand what level of surveillance a person should be under, but also to identify what needs a person has in terms of referrals to services. So probation was using this to both choose people for the program and help the navigator figure out what services they may need beyond those that the individual self-identified as needing, but parole did not. Parole was basing their selection process on whether or not the person had any gun crime in their past, and their kind of internal discretion of determining whether they thought the person would be a good fit for the program or was likely to reoffend. And given that some people were coming out of jail having served 17 years, it was unclear in some instances whether they were indeed at that heightened risk. So the current program, the one I'm about to present about this current version of the program, is based on our ongoing analysis of aggregated case files kept by the navigator, our analyses of arrest data that is being provided by the assistant state's attorney for all participants. And I've also conducted interviews with the program stakeholders thus far who are involved in implementing the program, to capture how they are selecting program participants, and how this version really deviates from the previous version. So thus far, call-ins have been happening on a quarterly basis. There have been 6 call-ins with approximately 12 to 14 individuals attending per call-in. Of the 77 individuals selected for the program, 66 ultimately attended a call-in or were custom notified. Custom notifications are a kind of one-on-one version of the call-in experience. And these are deemed appropriate for people in instances where the participant either has a no contact supervision order with another attendee, or if they're known to have rival gang affiliations with someone else in the program who would be attending the call-in. In some instances, they used custom notifications for individuals who didn't make it to the call-in because for an excused reason. For example, if they were ill or had a prior engagement that the probation or parole officer deemed excusable. And then some, but we did get some drop off between selection and entry into the call-in, in part because people were arrested between the selection and call-in. So So, and then of the 66 people who either attended a call-in or were custom notified, 46 ultimately signed up for services and completed an intake with the navigator as of this past February. So here we can take a look at the people who either attended a call-in or who were custom notified. And this is everybody, regardless of whether they followed up for services. So we can see here that most of the people are on parole and 24% of the people are on probation. And there's actually 3 people in the program who are simultaneously on parole and on probation. So, you know, the goal of this program is to provide that deterrent message and offensive services to those who are at a high risk of committing future offenses, particularly those that involve street violence and guns. So key to the program is that it's not cherry picking to provide services to the people who are the most receptive, but to provide them to the people who are most likely to commit crime. And so, like I said before, in the previous iteration, parole did not have any objective risk assessment for identifying those individuals. They were really kind of reliant on history of gun use, but now they do. So the characteristics that we see here really reflect the target participants for the program, and that they are all young men. The average age is 20 years old for parole and 24 years old for probation, who are scoring as high risk of committing additional offenses on parole and probation's respective risk assessment scoring tools. All indeed have a history of gun violence. You can note here 100% of the people who are chosen for the program on probation were on probation for a sentence for firearm possession, which makes sense because those are the offenses related to firearms that are probationable, that don't have a mandatory prison sentence. Of those who are on parole or MSR, we see that 58% were serving time for firearm possession prior to their release from prison, and that 36% were serving time for violent offenses, and most of those offenses did involve guns. We can also see here that the people called into the program are predominantly Black men. There has been one woman in the program so far. We've also done a little bit of mapping on where these participants are in terms of the addresses. And we can see here that they're largely clustered in Rockford's west and northwest side and within 3 zip codes. So nearly 60% of participants are from 3 kind of concentrated areas in Rockford. And that is actually more concentrated than the overall supervision population. And here we can see some of these emergent outcomes from the most current, from the current version of this program. So in terms of providing services, 46 people thus far have completed an intake and set at least one goal with the navigator. 38 of those people have also completed at least one goal. And this is following that call-in or custom notification, at which point their participation is entirely voluntary. And reviewing the kinds of goals that they're setting thus far, these goals are set by the participant, and they include things like finding employment, completing their GED, getting their CDL licenses, getting driver's license, reinstating, so on and so forth. Very similar to the first time around. Additionally, they are all providing the navigator with information about board orders if on parole and supervision conditions if on probation. And amongst those goals are really steps necessary to successfully complete the conditions of their supervision, right? So this will include things like accessing anger management programs or getting into substance abuse treatment, maintaining sobriety, finding work, and so forth. So it is interesting. It does appear thus far that there is a lower uptake here. In the previous version, about 88% of people in the pilot took advantage of services, and now it's more like 70%. So still most people, but a little bit different here. It'll be interesting to see if that maintains over the next 4 years. And of course, we're also concerned with recidivism and rearrest. Most of the participants who attended a call-in or were custom notified, about 86%, have not been rearrested for a new crime since entering the program. So all of those who've been rearrested, one individual was charged with murder. 2 have been charged with violent crimes short of murder. Those are aggravated battery, domestic violence crimes. 5 were charged with unlawful possession of a weapon. And 1 has been charged with possession of a controlled substance. Also, amongst the overall sample, 1 individual was murdered. So our evaluation findings of to date. Thus far, the program is meeting its goal of having 12 to 15 participants called in per quarter. And we have seen, that they're still engaging in that collaborative process where representatives from probation at the county level, from parole at the state level, and then also community members are really all working together to implement this program. One of our findings from or one interesting thing that has come out this time is that they've actually implemented an expedited process in order to handle violations, probation violations in particular, where probation is working closely with the circuit court to make sure that when people on their caseloads are violating, they're getting up before the circuit court judge quickly, and those are being handled swiftly, which aligns with those focused deterrence principles. This version has been somewhat improved upon the last, in that we're seeing that the participants being called in are high risk of committing additional offenses, and both probation and parole are using objective risk score assessments. All have histories of firearm possession, all have histories of violent crimes. Speaking with the stakeholders, they all believe that they are talking to and interacting with the people in this program who are the most likely to re-engage in gun violence. And again, we're seeing a relatively high intake for services for a program that really is voluntarily and also has that deterrent messaging with it. But maintaining that engagement has been a challenge. And that has to do in part, I believe, with just the nature of what it's like to be a person experiencing reentry. The navigator says that, she'll have people who work with her for like a couple weeks and then disappear for like a couple months and then come back when they maybe need more help, right? If their housing falls through, or if they lose their job, or want some more help moving forward. And again, we're seeing a relatively low rate of arrest for new crimes among the sample, given what we would expect of such a high risk group. So our kind of next steps in this project, we're looking to start coding the call-in recordings. And I'm excited to kind of move into this aspect of it because we've seen some new and interesting dynamics with the call-in that we did not see the previous time. So we're seeing actually more conversation from the community members who are attending that is not directed at the call-in participants. But is in fact directed at the officials within the call-in, right? So some of the participants some of the community members who are speaking as representing the community are not only speaking to the participants and saying the violence must stop, and relating their own experiences of gun violence, but they're starting to actually talk to the officials and turn and start facing the officials and saying, well, what are you doing to better things in our community? So I'm interested to see, to kind of dig in there and take a closer look at that dynamic, which is new for this time around. We're also about to begin interviewing program participants. And this time, I'm hoping to get access to more of those who are unengaged or who have stopped services or are, in that cycle of doing services for a while, checking out and coming back in, to talk to them about their experiences within the program and what it would take to get them more fully engaged. Finally, we're also wanting, since we have since this program will be running longer, it's been funded for 4 years, we're going to be able to take a look at that first year of participants and match them with people who score very similarly on risk score assessments, who are also on probation and parole, but who did not access the program or receive services, to see if we can do a recidivism analysis that kind of compares apples to apples in terms of examining outcomes. And then finally, I think this time around, we're exploring doing actually a focus group with some of the people who've spoken at the call-ins as the community voice, to get a sense of what they view as being important for this program moving forward. And so if you are interested in learning more, I know Dave said he was going to drop some stuff in the chat, but I think we also we can make these slides available. I have some links here. The first is to our old website that has some of the reports that we did about the first program evaluation, as well as some data regarding surveys of the community and their terms of safety. You're also welcome to explore our website and then to follow us on Twitter, which we just started doing. All right, thank you. I'm happy to field some questions here with Dave.
Thank you both. Christine, go ahead. You're muted still, Christine.
My first comment was duh, but anyway. So what I wanted to know, duh, that I was muted, that is there any difference that you've been able to discern, or are you looking at the people who decide to take the service as opposed to the people who don't? Is there any demographic differences, any differences in anything in their profile?
We haven't done that yet, just because at this point the numbers are still pretty small to be able to look at, but that's a good point. And then
moving along, of those people who offended or reoffended, how are they different? Are they more likely to be the people who didn't participate in the program or who did?
So we have just kind of begun looking at that. I did like a rough, we're talking about a small group of people thus far, right? Yeah. And I did a rough look at it. And in terms of interacting with the navigator, yeah, most of the people who got rearrested did do an intake, but almost all the sample did, right? So, I'm not seeing any necessarily difference there.
But whether they continually receive services from the navigator might be a different. You don't know that.
Right. So, yeah. Whether they're actively highly engaged. Yeah.
It's almost like we've got to figure out a way to really measure active engagement, because as Amanda pointed out, people kind of come in and out of their interaction with the navigator. As issues come up, they may reach back out. There's issues about how long the people are being tracked, that's going to influence some of this stuff. So we'll ultimately be able to hopefully tease out some of those, provided that the numbers are sufficient to allow us to do that.
And then my last question is, and this is in terms of deterrence. One is that if you reoffend, you're going to be caught, and you're going to have the consequences. But I'm wondering, I mean, because I know this is a problem in Chicago, that a lot of cases aren't closed. I was wondering, does Rockford have that problem too?
Yeah, I mean, every large city has a challenge solving or clearing violent crimes that are oftentimes the focus of these kinds of interventions. Illegal firearm possession is difficult to detect. Shootings aren't often solved. It's not as bad in Rockford as it is in Chicago, but that's a challenge. But the important point with this is that it's not only them engaging in criminal activity, it's them being non-compliant with other aspects of their supervision. So if they're ordered to attend substance use treatment and they're non-compliant with that, there can be sanctions for that. I think one of the interesting things about the program is it's called focused deterrence, but it's not just about deterrence. And at least my thinking on it is part of that's a marketing thing, right? The focused deterrence makes it sound like it's an enforcement apparatus, and that's the primary thrust of it. But the research and this program is really that the provision of services by somebody who is trusted is really what's going to ultimately make the change in behavior. You know, Amanda's talked to people that are in the program, and their response is, we know what the legal consequences of breaking the law are. That's not a surprise to us, but this offer of assistance outside of the justice system apparatus, you know, not relying on the probation officer, the parole officer, is something that's unique, and that will ultimately be what shifts behavior.
Yeah, and I would actually add to that, not just someone who is providing those services, but someone who has like a really good understanding of how their parole and probation works has been key, which not all service providers have. So the navigator being able to like sit down and explain to the person on parole, here's like the mechanisms by which, you know, if you do these things, you may be able to get off early. If you do these things and go to this thing, they're going to think that you're doing well, and they're going to maybe, you know, lower your supervision level. Has been something that I've heard people talk about. Yeah, and particularly with probation, the navigator sits down with probation on a regular basis, and they have kind of similar to what I've seen in other programs, like sit meetings, like they sit and talk through each client and how they think they're doing and what they need. And like, that level of coordination between services and criminal justice, I think is really, really interesting.
Gina?
Thank you for the presentation. I found it really interesting. I had Amanda present about the pilot, I believe, to my class last year, and they also thought that it was really interesting. And one of the things that we had connected it to was how, when you were talking about goal setting with the navigator and also providing the social services as the key element that makes this like effective, at least it seems like that is emerging. How related to just poverty this whole thing is, because the goal setting is so like, I need to have a form of transportation, I need to have some form of identification, I need some form of stable housing. And it's like, if that is the most effective sort of part of, along with the navigator, then this could also, I know this is outside of the scope of this project, but it sort of provides evidence for violence prevention via targeted anti-poverty programs to these, you know, high-risk reoffenders. So there was just one sort of observation I had. And then the other sort of more question I had was this single charismatic sort of navigator model.
Yeah.
I worry about that. Like, do you all like sort of worry about that? Because what happens if she takes another job? I mean, you know, and it seems like also so successful because she's so good at explaining to folks and humanizing them, like treating them like humans. And so what happens if you need to replace her with somebody who's like, wah, wah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because in the pilot version, she was a governmental employee that was hired as part of that grant to fulfill this role. And then they offered her the same position this time around. And she said, no, write me into the grant as my own nonprofit organization. And she's hired 2 other navigators that she's training who also have lived
Oh,
experience.
that's awesome.
Yeah. And then has last time I was out, I went to her office and she's got a full staff, and everybody in her organization has either been in prison or has been on probation in Rockford, which is cool. So she's kind of, replicating herself, I guess.
Wow, that's great news.
Yeah, but the point you bring up, Gina, though, is it's important beyond just the navigator. I mean, I think the unique thing that we're seeing in Winnebago County since we've been there is a high level of commitment and agreement among all the stakeholders. And so it's not just what happens if the navigator goes, it's what happens if the mayor changes, or what happens if the state's attorney changes, or the sheriff. Because an earlier version of an approach like this occurred in Rockford, and it was very much almost an antagonistic kind of program. It was the city of Rockford being highly critical of the other stakeholders for not being punitive enough and using incarceration enough. And so it's like that with any kind of program like this, that it's covers all levels of government and all branches of government, is you've got to have that cohesion. And up to this point, there's been that support. And as Amanda said, the mayor comes and welcomes people who are coming out of prison back to the community, and has a message that's extremely positive, which could easily shift if a mayor said, why are we welcoming people back? They should stay in prison, or those kinds of things. So it can change a lot with differences in the elected officials behind it. But so far so good, right? And they're really trying to do something comprehensive beyond just this program. Again, some people that we presented this to said, well, what about preventing this in the first place? Rockford's doing that, or they're trying to do that with a lot of new innovative programs that are really designed to address the early signs that a child is being exposed to trauma or violence and intervening. But you have to recognize that those aren't always going to work, and you have to have a mechanism in place for this other end of the continuum. So,
yeah.
Thank you. That's really just to respond to that. That's so important, and I have not, admittedly, I've not read the reports on this, but when you're talking to other people who could possibly replicate this program or policymakers, do you make that point in your reporting that part of what makes this even effective at all is that we have these players that really allow for the emphasis on service delivery and stuff as being a key component?
Yeah, it really goes back to our original interaction with Winnebago County in 2016 and the creation of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, because it's through that avenue that we seek to educate all of the elected stakeholders about crime and about effective programming and what programs do and don't work. And so it really is, when you ask that, it made me think of that is we've, to some degree, I'd like to think, played a role in facilitating that. And it's really, some of our earliest work, and I dropped it in the link, one of our first reports was just looking at what does crime look like in Rockford? What do sentencing practices look like? And it showed them that crime was going down. Despite everything that they perceived, crime was going down. And despite what their intuition might suggest, putting someone on supervision in the community actually was beneficial in terms of lower likelihoods of people engaging in violence, as opposed to sending them to prison and them getting out. So they all understand that and they recognize it, and that's part of why they've tried to make some of these changes. But it's somewhat tenuous, right? You've got to, ensure that there's that working relationship. We've approached other jurisdictions and offered the same kind of facilitation and discussion and research. Kind of our rule is if you can't get the majority of people to even come to a meeting, then the ability for us to facilitate a collaborative discussion is really limited. If a certain group of stakeholders won't even show up, it's going to be tough for you to implement a program that's collaborative if you can't even agree to come to a meeting and engage in dialogue. So,
Other questions? Christine, I muted you again, so you're going to need to unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the points that Gina was raising, because so many of the things that you said about the quality of the service provider, the relationship of the service provider to the participant on one hand, and then also the things you said about collaboration and being almost and sort of bringing that information to the collaboration, helping form that collaboration. Really, I think, we could see that in other collaborations that we've done in other areas. And I think in some ways enough hasn't been written about that, and talking about, this is the value of that kind of collaboration, and this is how you approach it. And obviously, you're right. There's some places that the soil is infertile for that right now, and other places that it is. But I think that as researchers who do this kind of work and see these findings, that should be a message and some scholarly work that we do to communicate that. Yeah, that was my editorial comment.
Thanks, Christine. Other folks have questions or comments or editorial comments or otherwise?
I have a question. Sorry, it's the Christine and Gina show. Sorry. I swear other people can talk. But I was just wondering how, so in the latest model, in the latest implementation, you had 86% that had no rearrests, correct?
Yeah.
How does that compare to other similar programs? Because it sounds really good.
Yeah. I mean, so it does. First, I would say it's probably too early to start comparing to other similar programs, right? In part because they're having those call-ins on a regular basis. So some of those 86 are people who've been in the program for a month, right?
Okay, that's
just as right. So it's probably early to start doing that.
We have some, we've done research in Winnebago County to understand what's the overall pattern of rearrest among their probation and parole population. Among all the people released from prison, it's over 50% are arrested for something within 3 years. Again, we presented that early on to the stakeholders and showed them that the percent that are arrested for a violent crime is actually much smaller than they assumed or expected. That's what gave rise to this program is, okay, but what can we do about that small percent that do engage in violence? Is there a way for us to identify them and intervene? And so we do have some comparisons, at least, that would suggest that this is on the right track. But to Amanda's point, to make a fair comparison, we got to make sure we have similar people that we're comparing and also similar follow-up periods, which will be coming, as we work on this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I saw Elijah's microphone go off then on again, so I wanted to.
Sure did.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I've really enjoyed this seminar so far. I'm a criminal justice major. I did my undergrad at Loyola. I'm also an employee at Loyola in the Center for Science and Math Education. I know David very well, and David, I know you as well from being criminal justice faculty. And I got my degree back in 2008, but I kept up on all the episodes of Law and Order. So up to speed. I just had a question for Amanda with this pilot, and just to piggyback on Gina's comment. How far do you think we are away from maybe implementing this type of strategy or focused deterrence within the Chicago PD?
Oh,
Everybody
know the
vote in the
samples-
runoff.
The sample size is a lot smaller because Chicago has such a greater population, but do you see somewhere down the line in the near or distant future, they may consider, once all of the political air clears, political dust clears, and we get a new mayor in house, regardless of who it may be, that they may consider something like this, or are they waiting to see more data be accumulated through the Winnebago Rockford?
No, I think Chicago has some iterations of this. So this isn't something that Chicago's not aware of. They've implemented things like this that have been the subject of some research. They've struggled with issues similar to what they've struggled with in Rockford. When law enforcement is coming to you to deliver a message, do you answer the door? And who else has to be accompanying them literally at the door for them to open it and hear the message? So there are similar efforts like this occurring in Chicago. They've actually developed some fairly sophisticated ways to identify who's at risk, not only of perpetration, but of victimization. And so they've done some similar things like this. I'm not aware of the degree to which those have been subject to evaluations that are available, but they are trying similar types of things. Again, to your point, it's a lot more complicated because, you know, in Rockford, they're dealing with a couple probation officers that are working on it and a couple parole agents. In Chicago, you've got hundreds of probation officers and hundreds of parole, you know, so it's the coordination thing, I think, is where it gets a lot more complex and difficult, which is why it's nice in Rockford, because people are much more familiar to each other and can engage in this a little bit more effectively. So, but I didn't want you to leave thinking that Chicago's never heard of this and it's not anything on the radar. They have heard of it. They are doing some similar kinds of things.
Oh, okay, great. I just had two more questions, quick ones. With the navigator that you used in the pilot, I understand it was a female, but are you considering using males as well, just to see if there's a difference in the response to the gender of the navigator? As far as I've always been told that even in prison and with the corrections officers, the inmates tend to respond less aggressively when they're dealing with a female than they are with males. So I just thought I'd just ask that question just to see if that was under consideration, or it just happened that you used a female navigator in this pilot. But moving forward, you'll use male, female, who's ever qualified or willing to do it.
I mean, I think like the navigator has definitely talked about the fact that she's a woman as being a plus and interacting with the people on her caseload, right? Particularly because she takes, you know, she like at the cons will openly be like, I know your moms, I know your aunties, like, you know, I am part of that community. Like I will work with them and with you, right? Which is a very, you know, gendered kind of way of going about it. And it seems to, you know, be working thus far. But there's that question of like, you know, she also tries to hook them up with, there's some groups in Rockford who, you know, are male only spaces for people who are experiencing reentry, right? That and so in both the pilot and now she's hooking men up into those spaces to go to some of those support groups. In terms of whether, you know, it would be interesting to see if, you know, one of the new navigators that she's hired is a man. So it'd be interesting to see if that, you know, how his experiences might be different, interacting and connecting with people.
Okay.
Yeah, but it is an interesting question, Elijah, because it you know, Amanda described the navigator as a supplement to probation and parole, and when you look at the composition of the probation and parole staff, at least what we've seen is there are differences. The parole staff tend to be much more likely to be male officers, and the probation are women. So it's an interesting combination. I think the most important thing about the navigator isn't necessarily the gender, as much as she is from Rockford. She knows Rockford, and she has lived what they've lived through. The parole officers might not even be residents of Rockford. They could live anywhere in northern Illinois. They may not know the community the same way. So I think there's some interesting ways to cut that, but that's a good question.
Okay. And the final question, I probably already know the answer, but when you had the pie graph up and where are they after the ones that reoffended, and the section for the percentage of violent crimes committed, does that include aggravated sexual assault?
There have not been any aggravated, like no one who has been rearrested has been rearrested for sexual assault.
Okay.
I think it's all been either aggravated battery, which I believe was one person was aggravated battery and one person was domestic violence.
Okay. Thanks for clearing that up. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Elijah. Good to see you.
You're welcome. Likewise.
I think we've got time for at least one more question, if there is one. This is fascinating work. I've got a ton of questions, but I'll save them for one-on-ones with Amanda or Dave, or next time we go out for a beer or something. Because the work around the importance of the navigator just rings true to so many other things that we have done at Curl, that frontline staff. And I know it sounds like, and it is sort of a self-evident statement that, people who are having the primary interaction, of course, they're going to have this major impact. And yet I don't know that that's the way our funding or our understandings of programs go across numerous fields of service provision. So it's fascinating to hear the navigator story in this one. So I will turn it over to Amanda and Dave and say you can get the last word in here. And but I will say thank you to you all, and thank you to you both. And we hope to see you all again. But Amanda, Dave, any final comments?
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. And if you've got any students, or if you are a student that's interested in this work, there's work to be done. We've got opportunities for students to get involved in this research, but also other projects we're working on. So feel free to reach out directly to either Amanda or myself. So
Yeah. Oh, and also we should do a shout out to Anna, who's in here and cleaned a whole bunch of these administrative navigator records and sorted through what was some chaos for me. And I greatly appreciated Anna.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you both for sharing this information, for doing this great work, and the rest of the team. And we look forward to hearing more from you in future years. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Have a good weekend, everybody.